juices flowing. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is this thing called big city disease. Sounds nasty.
Right? Yeah. I mean, in some ways, it's like, oh, okay, so big city. What's wrong with that? I like big cities. I like New York. I like LA.
Right? Tons of stuff to do there, tons of stuff to see, people, things, lights, excitement.
Yeah. So how could it be considered a disease? And what is big city disease exactly?
So, big city disease is something that sort of has arisen, I think, just in the last few years, decades maybe. But it's when a mega city becomes plagued with environmental pollution, traffic congestion, a shortage of public services like education or like healthcare, medical care. There's just so many people basically in one space that it's hard to keep the environmental toxins at bay and also provide for all those people, right? And we're thinking mega cities, we're thinking very large urban centers where population and things and buildings are up, not out necessarily. They might also be out and up as well. And in this particular case, we're going to be talking about Shanghai. So in September of this year, the Chinese government actually set a limit to the population of Beijing. And this past Monday, they actually they set the same limit for Shanghai. So those are sort of two mega cities in China. And they want to limit the population of Shanghai, specifically this past Monday, to, they came out talking about wanting to limit it to 25 million people by 2035. I can't even wrap my mind around that number, 25 million people. That's amazing. I come from a city where I think we had maybe 3,000 people, and that seemed fairly large to me at the time. But 25 million people all living together in one space is incredible. And that's the limit they want to set. So they're not even there yet, and it's already, becoming a problem. And because they want to manage this big city disease that they've got going on. So they're a little, they don't have all of the details on how they're going to do that, right? Like, how do you enforce that? What do you just tell people, stop having children, stop moving to the city, stop doing things? And some of the, one of the things that they're going to do is that they're going to have some of the government agencies, some of the state-owned companies, and other what they call non-core functions of the Chinese capital are going to actually be moved to a newly created city 100 kilometers. Well, this is for Beijing, actually. I'm kind of jumping all over the place, but they're thinking about basically moving some of the companies further out so that people can actually move out of the city and live further away, but still have a reasonable commute. So that's what's one of the things that they're doing.
So it sounds like they're still building cities. They're still pushing the fact of this urbanization, but just that they want to have a new kind of point of interest or new kind of shining headquarters, if you will, in order to build out there, just so that way we don't see more urban decay and more issues with services, as you mentioned, because budgets get tightened. Even though with the more people you have in a city, they're still paying taxes or whatever, depending on city, state, country. They usually pay in something to the government for those services. But again, even then, that can still become very strained.
Right. And there's also, they've actually evicted tens of thousands of migrant workers from their homes because they live in unsafe buildings, right? Like when you're kind of cramming people into spaces, obviously they become unsafe. Maybe they don't get maintained as well. And the more and more people actually come to a big city, right, looking for jobs, looking for opportunities, looking for a change of scenery, it becomes harder for that city to actually maintain it, right? Because every year cities I believe most cities do this in the world. I'm kind of speaking out of my rear end right now, but I know in the US they send out census surveys. because they're trying to plan for an influx of people, right? They want to see, well, how many kids are we going to need schools for in 10, 20 years? How many, hospitals will we need? How many people are getting older? That kind of thing. So cities are trying to plan for this. But when people migrate suddenly, or they have large families, or, whatever the case may be, it's hard to take that into account into a census, right? They don't, it's hard to plan for the future. And so I think that's part of why, these big cities became sort of unmanageable. Because everyone, right, like especially if you're coming, I would imagine, from more of a rural area where certainly nowadays opportunities maybe aren't as plentiful or as appealing as they used to be. You're going to the big city to try to, make a life for yourself and your family, but the city can't really support you, right? So then that kind of sucks. So, yeah.
Well, yeah, and Mongo points out, and they're absolutely right. Yeah, they're still building, yet they're trying to go for less congestion, which is very interesting. But at the same time, I feel like potentially, again, speaking from, again, what my experiences are and my point of view, my perspective, is that potentially the Chinese government realizes, well, growth is not going to slow down any.
Right. And I don't think that they're, when they're trying to say that they want to limit the population, they're not trying to say, oh, it won't grow. Like, they obviously know that it's going to keep on growing. They're just trying to find ways to deal with it.
Yeah, so instead you're trying to displace some of that growth instead of all in one specific location somewhere else. Because actually, with China too, it's a massive, massive country. And really there are only a few core major cities that have seen massive growth. And a lot of people have moved out of many of the villages they once used to. We mentioned this actually in our last episode last week, where we spoke about, or actually 2 weeks ago, where we spoke about the photographer in Russia who took a picture of a burning village, who he happened to set on fire. But he wanted to take a picture to show that we are seeing in many countries, but specifically Russia in this case, this sense of rural decay, and how many people are going to the cities because they feel there are more opportunities, there are more jobs, there are many more things that can help them live the life that they're looking for, hopefully, right? And now, of course, unfortunately, it doesn't happen for everyone. There are still plenty of homeless in every single country, still plenty of people in these kind of shanty towns on the outskirts of these cities, because of this overpopulation. And perhaps by expanding it out, understanding that, hey, even though we can control how many children people can have in a family, we still can't control overall growth where people move to per se. I mean, we could try, but again, they're still going to see a lot of migration, a lot of shifting in where people go. So they figure, well, let's build a new point of interest to hopefully build out. Now, is this a long-term solution? I mean, I think it's definitely got some length to it, some life to it, but overall, when that city gets filled, then what do? Then they have to build another city. And then when that city gets filled, what do you have to do? You build another city. You try to restrict the amount of immigration you take in, right? You're going to also try to then control what cities or villages people specifically are designated to. And that's going to be really tough. I mean, there's already a lot of riots and outcry for the educational system and college education specifically in China, among many other social kind of, pillars that people want in their life, but the government has been trying to restrict them or control it. And so they're already seeing a bit of upheaval in specific areas. So, all of a sudden you get more and more people congested in these different areas, start educating themselves and go, wait a minute, I want these things though. And this is why I came to the city and I'm not getting them. You're going to see a lot more social upheaval too. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this all plays out.
Yeah, and to your point, and to what Dynamac is saying in chat, even if you could control, let's say, baby making, we're all living longer, right? So there's also that, I mean, to some degree, less, we live longer, and so there's just always more people at in the same place at the same time.
Yes, exactly.
That I think we also were not necessarily prepared for. I mean, this, and the allure of a big city, quote unquote, has kind of always existed, right? Even back when there were castles and forts and
Oh, yeah, right.
you had your smaller villages out in in the land, and then you had the bigger bustling urban centers that people were drawn to. But over the last few hundred years, population has exploded on the planet. And so you still have these, big mega cities now that have grown, and yet you can travel from one mega city to the other and barely see anybody else. We drove across country from Boston to SoCal, and barring some of the major cities that we stopped in, the rest of the time it was kind of sad and depressing and just empty.
Oh, yeah.
And it's amazing how, there's so many people that cluster only in the tiny area because of exactly what we were talking about: access to education, access to opportunities, to jobs, to entertainment, to culture, to you name it. And so that's fascinating to me as well, because, we depend on the government to some degree on so much, right? Because they're the ones that are going to be building the roads and the buildings where people live, and, sponsoring the companies that are going to be providing the jobs. And yet at the same time, I feel like they also get a lot of backlash to some degree because, oh, well, how did they not plan for this? Or, a lot of people are kind of doubting the feasibility, that word, feasibility of enacting such limits and trying to do some of this planning for the future. People are kind of laughing at the Chinese, the government trying to how are you going to enforce it? How are you going to do this? But at least they're trying to, right? I mean, they're seeing a need and they're trying to figure out a way to help mitigate it.
Yeah, and their goal for Beijing was to be met by 2020, which is only a few years away, and they're very close to the limit they've already set forth anyway. And then for Shanghai, that city, the goal is 2035 at the latest. And again, they're already almost to the point of the goal that they've set as a limiter. So what are they going to do then? What are they going to do? Because, they've said already that they're going to kick out, and they've started to kind of kick out many of the migrants who came from other villages, other cities, and say, oh, well, you're not designated for this city or whatever. And they've tried to move them out because they've seen a lot of issues already where you have overpopulation of buildings and you have people staying at locations where they shouldn't be, or they have a lot of people in one small apartment which shouldn't be, and it's caused actually issues like fires and a lot of deaths. So they're trying to mitigate that already, and so they're seeing people already living on top of one another. You have unsafe conditions, and it's causing bigger issues than just the one building, right? Especially if it's like, say, a fire, where then it spreads to many buildings and can take out a whole block. So they're really trying to think of ways to take this on, but yeah, how do you really limit and say, no, you're not allowed to live here, even though you are a Chinese citizen?
And we actually have an interesting image before and now of Shanghai. And this is just all in the span of a few decades. I mean, you can clearly see the incredible growth that city has experienced. It's unbelievable. And I mean, hey, the architecture is amazing to look at. I won't lie. When I was even looking at pictures of Shanghai, I was like, this place is gorgeous. Like, I love it. But then when you think about what that actually means to be in it, it's incredible, right? And especially if you're, I sit and I think about somebody who's living there, who's lived there all their life too, what that must feel like for them. Mm-hmm. What kind of lifestyle changes they themselves had to make. I know that, the city that I was in, the town that I grew up in, underwent massive changes while I was there. And even now going back to it, it's incredible to see it. It's not that it's unrecognizable, but I can see the trend happening there too. And again, it's not a big city, but lofts are coming and malls and this and that. And so then more and more people, and there's a huge number of universities in the area and everything like that. So it just this influx of people that there's no way that a census could predict. That like state officials could be like, yes, 20 years from now, lofts will be amazing. And we must prepare for them. So it's incredible. That image like blew my mind.
Oh yeah, and for those who are listening to us on Podbean, it's really a side-by-side image where you look at the city and you have some buildings, of course, and many residential areas, if you will, but you can actually see freaking trees. Like there's greenery there. And then you look at the same basic angle from more recently, and there are no trees. And most of the residential areas are basically in the shadow of these massive skyscrapers and business buildings, and the amount of light pollution, if you will, is intense. Like there are a ton of lights, and very reminiscent of, say, a downtown theater district of Chicago or of New York. And so massive billboards, massive marketing, lots of people, very little of actual nature to be seen. And again, this is relatively over a short period of time when you look at the lifespan of, let's say, a city, right? And its growth process. Many cities like this too. I mean, this isn't the only one. For instance, we mentioned Shanghai, also locations such as, let's see here, Istanbul has recently boomed as well. Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Jakarta, and even a lot of cities around the Arab Emirates and India have massively boomed and continue to grow. Chennai, India being one of them, Mumbai, many cities that have just blown up, and we keep seeing them grow and grow and grow. But what's interesting is we keep seeing the villages and smaller cities around them shrink and shrink and shrink. And so, yeah, how do you balance all of that out? It's always been this idea like, well, this is where all the commerce is, so I have to be here for a job, to live, and to be able to get access to the things I really need. Because for many of these people too, for instance, just to get to a doctor, it might take up to 5 hours to get to the main city to be seen. And so now it's like, well, yeah, why would I not move to the city? But if they don't have what you offer because things are too strained, it's a tough situation.
Well, I think one of the things that they don't really mention about the big city disease, which I personally think is a real thing, is mental health. That, living in such a busy place, it can be draining on someone, right? Even if you love living in a big city, that constant din, the constant shuffle of people, that bustle, it's exciting, and I love visiting cities for sure, but that can be draining, whether or not you consciously are aware of it, or whether or not you you love it or don't love it. It does affect you, right?
Oh, yeah.
Because we are, evolutionarily speaking, humans are social animals. We do create tribes, clans, that sort of thing, but this explosion of population is not something that we necessarily evolved quickly enough to be able to process it, just like with everything else, our technology, everything. So, it's interesting because I feel like if we probably even looked at mental health issues, and obviously there's more people, so statistically speaking, potentially there's more occurrences of a certain thing happening in that type of a population. But even if you look at percentages, I would imagine that you might even have higher happiness levels outside of cities.
Mm-hmm.
Again, depending, I guess, on how long your commute is, but...
Well, you could say, for instance, in the sense of stress, trying to get to place, resources where it's like you have to buy something, but there's a massive line, or the locations where you need to get certain items, they're all sold out because of the high levels of population. So yeah, it could already be much more stressful. And another thing, though, we should mention, and Dynamite kind of brings this up in our chat, is the fact that, stepping outside of the Western cultural perspective, which is what the best we can do is bring that perspective, because that's what we know, being from the US. But, especially Eastern culture and many other cultures, they are very family oriented. So it's not just about the success of one individual moving there, making it big, starting up a company and making billions. It is also about bringing the family with you too, for their safety, their security, and for, as you mentioned, that sort of social tribe. And of course, typically, what are the tribes that are closest to us? Well, that would be our families. And so many times you have multi-generational families in one location. And that's another thing. So when people move to these cities, it's not just them and a cat or them and a significant other. It's going to be them, their cousins, their grandparents, their brothers, sisters, potentially aunt and uncle. All different layers of that family tree are going to be in the same household. And he mentions too that Dynamite mentions that he sees it a lot in Georgia when you get a lot of families from China or from Mexico or Central America or South America, where they're very family oriented. You're getting multi-generational homes being started, which means a larger population suddenly comes in and everything kind of spikes.
Right. And hey, hanging out with your family, living with your family, it's got pros and cons. So I can definitely see, why people migrate together, as it were, as well.
Yeah, and Rainbow Smash actually hits on this too, where she says, the familial piety really makes big cities grow. When a person becomes successful in a big city, they will try to pull their entire family into one home. And that's the other thing too, is that when you pull people from an area where things cost less, into a place that's far more expensive, 10, 15, even 50% more expensive than what you're used to, you almost have no choice but to move with the entire family unit, because you need multiple people making an income to survive. It can't be just you and a significant other anymore.
Right, especially because in cities, I get it, space is at a premium because space is at a premium.
Mm-hmm.
You can't... If you don't have enough units in an apartment complex and you have to either find a way to resection those units to create quote unquote more space somehow magically, or you have to build on top of it, right? Then that costs money. And so where do you find that money? Oh, well, you just up the rent, or, you up the cost of all of the things that you sell in your store. Or, there's a lot of other factors too, where, I know a lot of people, myself included, complain about the high cost of cities, right?
Mm-hmm.
But I also get it. It's tough, right? It's like we've kind of been saying, that it's a balancing act that, certainly governments have to do, whether at the local level, the state level, the county level, the country level, however that particular country has its stuff sectioned out. But I love living near a big city. Like, that's great because opportunities are there, and the entertainment and the culture are there, and the medical healthcare bit is there. But I also love the fact that I can, drive half an hour and be in complete silence surrounded by nature.
Oh yeah, and sometimes it's good, as we've mentioned before, to just have that time to yourself, to take time to invest into yourself. And it can be very hard when everywhere you go, it relies on you in some way and how it impacts someone else. And sometimes it's just nice just to be able to step away from all that and go, okay, what I do only impacts me here, and I don't have to worry about anyone else or anything else per se. And, also RX Mongo in our chat brings up a great point too, is that it's very much like this kind of weird cyclical effect where more people come in because they're closer to healthcare, they're closer to education, they're closer to all these other amenities and resources. But then again, the more people that move there, the less resources, the less amenities, but also, for instance, the more pollution. And this is one of the reasons why Shanghai actually is so concerned with the amount of people in the city, because they're seeing a lot of issues with major pollution. And of course, what happens there is, yes, you're closer to the doctor, but you need to see the doctor more because of the pollution, because of what you're inhaling and your body is absorbing, because our body naturally does take the properties around it and take it in.
But that's okay, because that creates more jobs for doctors, and so more people can move to the city and be doctors and practice their medicine.
She's being a smartass, by the way. Just for those that are listening, can't really see her. She's being sarcastic. But yeah, it's very interesting to think about that, and that you're going to get more issues actually in the city, even though there's potentially more opportunity. Just because they say there's more opportunity doesn't mean it's positive opportunity. I have as much opportunity to get a job as I do getting sick all of a sudden now. And so things are balancing out, both the negative and the positive, and it makes it more difficult on those families, especially because they've just moved. They've got to spend more money. They're facing pollution. They're facing health issues, which means more costs on medication, seeing doctors, the whole process of just the adjustment for those that are not familiar with a bustling city and how to move through it and survive in it can be immensely stressful and can really impact you emotionally, but also eventually then physically too.
Yeah, I remember when I first went to New York City and I just got so dizzy. Like, I got dizzy from all the people. It was intense. And I think I was probably, just on a regular road. Like, I wasn't in Times Square or anything. But there were just so many people. I had never really, truly experienced that many people in one sidewalk before.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember I got dizzy. And I had to, steady myself and be like, okay, when do I go back to the hotel? Where is the hotel? Where am I? It was pretty crazy. But
and I think in a way too, talking about people coming from all over and then coming into a main city, even if you're from the same country, a lot of times, depending on the size of that country, you can have very different ways of speaking, different slang. You can have very different cultural aspects that can be looked as odd or different in the city. And so now here you are trying to adjust while trying to hold on to what you know and what makes you you, but you have that feeling of being forced to change and adapt in a way that isn't you in order just to survive in a city. And I think there are many people who tend to just rush and jump into the city, not even just for opportunity, but they might not be able to control it, right? Maybe there's war going on or issues with famine and sickness in their villages, and they just need to get away and they have to get to someplace new. And so they get forced into this situation where they have to go to these places, but they have a horrible time adjusting. And what ends up happening a lot of times is then we create these smaller tribes within a larger community, which can be really nice, but at the same time can also separate us and keep us separate, because now we're kind of still trying to stick to our own in a sense, without really trying to understand the other people and connect and broaden our horizons because of that fear of losing ourselves, losing our culture and what makes us us. And I think that's a really tough situation. With at least with the physical, you can go to a doctor ideally and get something prescribed or something, you know what I mean? You can get a sense of how to fix it. But psychology and your sense of your psyche and your emotional status can be so tough to try to work through. And you tend to be your biggest critic and the one that beats yourself up the most, right? And so how do you break that cycle too? So, I give it up for anyone who especially comes from a very small city or village or town and goes into the city. But yeah, there are a lot of things to think about too, and how it might not be the best idea.